The Grand River runs shallow in late summer. Its valley opens wide beneath the sky, rimmed by buttes that rise from the grassland like monuments to time. The land here holds no trees except along the water, where cottonwoods mark the creek beds. In 1823, this territory belonged to no one and to everyone. The Missouri River drainage was unmapped, its tributaries unnamed by the men who would soon travel them. The nearest American outpost lay more than 200 miles south. Hugh Glass was approximately 40 years old that August. His origins remain unclear. Some accounts place his birth in Pennsylvania, to parents who had emigrated from Ireland. Other details of his earlier life appear in various narratives but cannot be confirmed. By 1823, he was employed as a hunter and trapper with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, an enterprise organized by General William Henry Ashley. The company sought beaver pelts. Glass was one among many men who answered advertisements placed in St. Louis newspapers calling for trappers willing to ascend the Missouri into unmapped country. The expedition had already suffered losses. In June, Arikara warriors had attacked the party near the confluence of the Missouri and Grand Rivers. Several men died. Glass himself was shot in the leg during that encounter. After regrouping at Fort Kiowa on the Missouri, the survivors, now under the leadership of Ashley's partner Andrew Henry, set out overland toward the Yellowstone River. They traveled in small groups to avoid detection. The route took them northwest through what would later become South Dakota. Glass was scouting ahead of the main party, searching for game. The terrain was uneven, cut by ravines and dense thickets of brush along the waterways. On or around August 23, near the forks of the Grand River in present-day Perkins County, he came upon a grizzly bear with 2 cubs. The meeting was abrupt. The distance between them was insufficient. The bear charged. Adult female grizzlies in that region commonly weighed between 300 and 400 pounds. The animal struck Glass before he could raise his rifle. She bit into his throat and chest, tore at his back and legs, and threw him to the ground. His screams brought other members of the party. They shot the bear. When the animal fell away from Glass, the men could see the extent of his injuries. His throat was punctured. Breathing appeared to produce a whistling sound through torn tissue at the side of his neck. The flesh of his back had been ripped open, exposing ribs. His leg was broken. Blood loss was significant. One account, attributed to trapper Hiram Allen, who was present, describes the wounds as mortal in appearance. The men wrapped Glass in a bear hide and constructed a litter from branches. They carried him for 2 days, but progress slowed to less than a mile per day. The group was in Arikara territory. Andrew Henry needed to keep moving. Henry called for volunteers. He asked for 2 men to remain with Glass until he died, then bury him and rejoin the group. A man named John S. Fitzgerald and a younger man, later identified in some sources as Jim Bridger, stepped forward. The main party moved on. Fitzgerald and the youth began digging a grave. Glass did not die. For 5 days he lay beside a spring, unable to speak or move, his breathing shallow. Fitzgerald and his companion waited. They were alone in hostile country, with no certainty the main party had escaped detection. On the 5th day, they made a decision. They took Glass's rifle, knife, flint, and other equipment. They covered him with the bear hide. Then they left. When they caught up with the main party, they reported that Glass had died and been buried. Andrew Henry accepted this account. The expedition continued west. Glass regained consciousness an unknown number of hours or days later. He was alone. The nearest American settlement, Fort Kiowa, lay more than 200 miles to the southeast. He had no weapons, no tools, no food, no means to make fire. His leg was broken, his back torn open, his throat damaged. He could not stand. His mobility was limited to dragging himself forward using his arms. He set the bone of his own leg. The method is not described in historical accounts, but the result allowed limited use of the limb. To prevent infection, he allowed maggots to consume dead tissue in his wounds. This practice, though not widely understood at the time, was observed by some frontiersmen as a means of cleaning injuries in the absence of other options. Glass began to crawl. The direction he chose was south and east, toward Fort Kiowa. His navigation method is uncertain, but one prominent butte in the region, later known as Thunder Butte, was visible for many miles and served as a landmark to travelers. The terrain was mixed grassland and broken country, cut by gullies and dry creek beds. Water was available from the Grand River and its tributaries, but food was scarce. He moved slowly. Accounts vary, but most estimates suggest he covered between 1 and 2 miles per day in the early stages. He subsisted on berries, roots, and whatever insects or small animals he could catch without tools. There are no records of his thoughts or physical sensations during this period. The crawl continued for weeks. When he reached the Cheyenne River, approximately 60 miles from the attack site, he constructed a raft from driftwood and brush. The Cheyenne flows east, eventually joining the Missouri near present-day Pierre, South Dakota. Glass used the current to carry him. He did not steer so much as drift, clinging to the logs. The river provided both transportation and a source of food. Small fish and mussels could be gathered from the shallows. At some point during the river journey, Glass encountered a bison calf that had been killed by wolves. The wolves had not finished eating. Glass waited until they left, then took what remained. The meat, though partially consumed, represented the first substantial food he had eaten since the attack. He stayed near the carcass for several days, eating and allowing his body to recover some strength. The river journey lasted weeks. By the time he reached Fort Kiowa in early October, approximately 6 weeks had passed since the bear attack. He was able to walk, though with difficulty. His wounds had begun to close, but scarring was extensive. The men at Fort Kiowa knew him. His arrival was considered extraordinary. Word of his survival spread through the frontier network of trappers and traders. Glass did not remain at Fort Kiowa. After recovering for a period that accounts do not specify clearly, he set out again. His stated purpose was to find the men who had abandoned him. He traveled north and west, retracing the route of the original expedition. By late October, he reached the Yellowstone River and located the site where Andrew Henry's party had established a winter camp. The camp was abandoned. A note indicated the group had moved further west to the mouth of the Bighorn River. Glass continued. When he reached the new camp, he found the young man who had left him. The identity of this individual is disputed in historical sources, but many accounts suggest it was Jim Bridger, who would later become a well-known mountain man. Glass confronted him but did not take revenge. The reasons are not documented in any account written by Glass himself, but later sources attribute the decision to Bridger's youth. Glass reportedly accepted an explanation and did not pursue further action. Fitzgerald was not at the camp. Glass learned he had left the mountains and enlisted in the United States Army. He was stationed at Fort Atkinson, near present-day Omaha, Nebraska. Glass re-enlisted with Ashley's company and worked through the winter and into early 1824. In February, he was selected as part of a small party dispatched to carry messages to Fort Atkinson. The route took them east through the Powder River country, then south along the Platte River. Near the Black Hills, the party encountered a group of Arikara. The leader of the group was known to Glass from previous encounters and claimed peaceful intentions. The men went ashore. While inside the leader's lodge, Glass noticed their equipment being taken by other members of the tribe. He warned his companions. The men fled. 2 were killed by warriors who pursued them. Glass escaped by hiding among rocks until the search was abandoned. He was separated from the other survivors. He traveled alone to Fort Kiowa, arriving weeks later. From Fort Kiowa, Glass made his way north to Fort Atkinson. He arrived in late spring or early summer of 1824. Fitzgerald was there. Glass confronted him. The encounter is described in a letter written by another trapper, but the details are second-hand. According to this account, Glass demanded the return of his rifle. Fitzgerald, as a soldier, could not be killed without consequences under military law, and Glass did not press further. The fort's commanding officer ordered Fitzgerald to return the weapon. Before leaving, Glass reportedly told Fitzgerald that if he ever left the army, he would be hunted down. Whether Glass meant this threat is unknown. He left Fort Atkinson and returned to the mountains. For the next 9 years, he worked as a trapper and hunter in the upper Missouri region. Records of this period are sparse. He was employed at various times by different fur companies and occasionally worked independently. In the winter of 1832 to 1833, Glass was employed as a hunter for the garrison at Fort Union, a trading post near the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers in present-day North Dakota. In late winter, he and 2 other trappers, Edward Rose and Highland Menard, set out on the Yellowstone River, likely to scout for beaver. They were attacked by Arikara warriors on the ice. All 3 men were killed. The date is uncertain but is generally placed in early 1833. Glass was approximately 50 years old at the time of his death. The location of his burial, if any, is not recorded. No marker was placed. His name appeared in a few letters and journals kept by other trappers, but for decades his story circulated primarily as oral tradition among mountain men. The first written account was published in 1825 in a Philadelphia literary journal called the Portfolio. The piece was anonymous but was later attributed to James Hall, a writer with connections to the fur trade. The account contained embellishments. Later retellings added further detail, some of it contradictory. What can be verified is limited. Glass was attacked by a bear in August 1823 near the Grand River in present-day South Dakota. He was abandoned by two men who took his equipment. He survived and traveled more than 200 miles to Fort Kiowa without weapons or supplies. The journey took approximately 6 weeks. He recovered, returned to the mountains, and continued working as a trapper until his death nearly 10 years later. The psychological dimensions of his experience, his thoughts during the crawl, his motivations for continuing, and his feelings toward the men who left him are not recorded in his own words. No diary or first-hand account by Glass exists. A monument was placed near the site of the bear attack in the 20th century. It stands on the southern shore of Shade Hill Reservoir in Perkins County, South Dakota. The monument is made of stone. It marks the approximate location where the event occurred, though the exact site is unknown. The landscape has changed. The reservoir was constructed in the 1940s, flooding portions of the Grand River Valley. Visitors to the monument see open country. The buttes that Glass would have seen still rise in the distance. The river is now submerged beneath the reservoir, but the land around it remains sparsely populated. The nearest town, Lemon, lies several miles to the north. Few people come to the monument. It is not on the way to anywhere. The road is gravel. The wind is persistent. The story of Hugh Glass has been adapted into novels, films, and poems. Most of these works are fictional. They invent dialogue, create motivations, and impose narrative structure on events that were likely experienced as a sequence of immediate physical problems requiring immediate physical solutions. The emotional content of the ordeal is unknowable. Glass left no statement. What remains is the fact of distance. 200 miles is not a symbolic measurement. It is a specific physical space that must be crossed. In 1823, that distance through unmapped country, without tools or food, with severe injuries, required 6 weeks of continuous forward movement. The only rest was unconsciousness or the brief periods when the body could not be forced to continue. There was no rescue. The decision to continue was made repeatedly, each time the option to stop was available. Human endurance is often discussed in terms of will or spirit, but it is a physical process. The body continues or it stops. Glass's body continued. This is the only certainty. Whether that continuation was driven by revenge, by survival instinct, by stubbornness, or by something else cannot be determined. The crawl itself is documented. The interior experience is not. The bear that attacked Glass was killed immediately after the encounter. Her cubs likely died without her. The men who abandoned Glass lived. Fitzgerald remained in the army, his fate after the confrontation unknown. Bridger became one of the most famous mountain men of the 19th century, living into old age. Andrew Henry left the mountains within a few years and returned to Missouri. The Arikara who killed Glass in 1833 are not named in any record. The story is told because the distance is difficult to comprehend. 200 miles without tools. The repetition of the fact does not make it more understandable. It remains what it was, a series of days in which forward motion was maintained despite injury, hunger, and isolation. No version of the story, whether embellished or factual, can convey the texture of that experience. It is outside the range of most human reference. What happened to Hugh Glass in the late summer of 1823 was not heroic in the sense of intention. It was survival pursued past the point where survival seemed possible. The outcome was not predetermined. Glass could have died at any point during the journey. He did not. That is the event. A man crossed 200 miles of wilderness alone after being mauled by a bear and abandoned without equipment. It happened once. It has not been repeated.